Amina. Hey, Craig.
Hello, how you going?
Yeah, good.
Good. Sorry, I'm just finishing.
I'm finishing lunch.
Hi, Mina. Oh, still connecting.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
Hey, Pete.
Background, Ben.
I think it's ripped off one of the Windows background images.
Yep.
Just yeah. Last minute ditch before I started lecturing to put something on the back. Not my office, with my office mate occasionally present behind me.
I can send you one of the ANU ones if you like, but you know.
I did see, yeah, that zip folder.
Yeah. This one's a bit more exciting though. Cool. So who else? We've got Natasha and David as well. So Mina, you all good with moderating?
Yeah, I guess so. I'll see how I go.
Live.
Oh, Peter, I'm guessing the questions from the audience will come up on, there's like a Q&A thing at the bottom, and they'll pop up from there for me to read out.
Yes, yeah. So that will come through the Q&A there.
Okay.
Thanks to those who have just joined us. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes just for a few more people to join the chat, and then we'll be able to get underway. Welcome, Natasha, as well. So I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes to ensure a few more people join as well. We've certainly found any other sessions, lots of people sort of coming in that first five minutes. So. I feel like we should have some official ANU hold music for the very start. Okay, all right. We might just start with the video then, and then we will. I'll hand over to Mina to lead the panel session this afternoon. All right, just
Thanks. Cool. So this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available after the event. You'll be able to ask your questions or make comments via the Q&A tab down at the bottom of your screen. If you don't wish for your questions or your comments to be in the recording, please contact science@anu.edu.au after the event and we will leave those details from the recording. Before we formally begin, I want to acknowledge any First Nations people who are joining us today and here in Canberra we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Nambiral country and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Good afternoon everyone. I hope you're having a lovely day so far in. My name is Mina Sreedharan and I'll be moderating this brilliant panel today looking at conservation in the 21st century. It's wonderful to see you all here and hoping that many of you will enter the world of conservation as we need as many hands as we can get. And it's great to see some of the work that we're doing here at the Fenner School and allow you guys to see what we're doing and what we're getting up to. I'll ask everyone to briefly introduce themselves, stating their role in the Fenner School, their topic of expertise. And to begin with, Natasha, would you like to start?
Sure, thanks Mina. So I'm a research fellow in David Lindenmaier's lab and I work on reintroductions of threatened species to Buddery National Park, which is a national park a few hours east of Canberra. I've also got done work in fire ecology, so I have a background in that from working with state government.
Cool. Thanks, Natasha. I'll hand it over to Ben as our next speaker.
Hello everyone, I'm Ben Shield. I'm a research fellow in the Fenner School. I work with a range of different topics, including fire, most recently the impact of fire on frogs throughout Eastern Australia, as well as biodiversity in farmland, as well as invasive species. And so things like chytrid fungus, which is affecting many of the frogs across the world.
Thanks, Ben. Craig, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, hi, thanks Mina. My name's Craig. I'm a researcher and a lecturer at the Fenner School. My research area looks at soil and wind erosion, but also looks at the biological life that grows in the soil surfaces and how that changes the rates of wind erosion, particularly in the arid and the semi-arid Australia. I also have a role in the school where I look after the whole curriculum package of the school. So I sort of work with all the conveners and all the teaching staff to make sure that the experiences that the students get are as top shelf as we possibly can get.
Thanks so much, Craig. And finally, David.
Hello, everyone. My name's David Lindenmaier. I've been at the Fenner School for maybe too long, 28 years. And I specialise in working on large-scale long-term projects and many of our undergraduate students, but also our postgraduate students come and work on some of these sites, be they in Jervis Bay, on the coast of New South Wales, in the woodlands west of here, and also in the wet forest in Victoria.
Sweet. Thanks, David. And finally, myself, Mina. I'm a PhD student here at the Fenner School. I'm about 3 years into my PhD and I'm looking at answering the question, what makes a plant rare? And hopefully I can use my knowledge to assist in threatened species conservation, particularly for threatened plants. Now, on to our discussion. I'll ask some of our panelists a few questions and they'll provide answers and they're welcome to jump in as they please. And then we'll open the floor for you guys to insert your questions and your comments so we can answer them too. Now, our first question, which I might put to David to answer or to start off with, is what exactly is conservation science and ecology? And can you provide a bit of an overview in terms of work done in Australia and perhaps globally?
Gosh, Mina, that's a big question. So conservation biology, conservation science really is about ways to conserve biodiversity in all kinds of different settings. So sometimes it involves conserving plants and animals in national parks and reserves, but at other times it'll be in wood production forests or in plantations or agricultural land. And the important thing in Australia is that almost all of the species that occur here occur nowhere else. And so we have a really important custodial and national estate role in conserving the biodiversity of this country. And we have a disproportionate number of species relative to other places of similar landmass. So we have a really important role to play in that space. And so there's an enormous amount of work to do, particularly because Australia has sadly led the world in mammal extinctions and the extinctions of many other groups of species. So there's a lot of work to do, and Australia has a very strong record in this case. Some of the world's best conservation scientists have come from Australia and are working here in Australia. So there's really quite a pedigree, and the Fenner School is one of the leaders in the world in this area of species conservation and ecosystem conservation. So it's a really important area to be involved in, and one where there's enormous opportunities.
Brilliant. Ben, would you like to add anything to that?
That's a really good response. It's hard to follow on from. So in the context of the Fenner School and how we try to teach that message, we really start with all the core principles that underpin conservation science. So there's a focus on how to collect information, how to interpret or interrogate information, data that you're collecting, as well as how to learn the hands-on practical skills. So we have a focus across several courses here, trying to understand those factors that David mentioned in terms of why species are occurring where they occur, what are the threats to different species, and what can we do about those threats to species, ultimately with the goal of trying to prevent species extinctions, as well as just trying to maintain species across the landscape.
Thanks, Ben. And Craig, how does the importance of soil link to work done in conservation and ecology?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. I think the world of soil ecology and understanding about the connectivity between what's below ground and above ground is really quite powerful and really important. And that understanding is increasing rapidly as our tools of measuring and monitoring are changing. There's been some great work coming out of the Fenner School looking at the role of marsupials and how they start to move the soil around or create microhabitats, which then cascade in a whole range of ecological functions as well. So just that simple transfer of soil, moving nutrients, creating germination locations, starts to present that notion of rebuilding a community or an ecological system. So yeah, there's a lot of powerful linkages between all sorts of biophysical drivers.
Thanks, Craig. Anything to add, Natasha?
I'll just say that all the research that happens here at Buddery is really important for improving our management of our threatened species and communities. And so, for example, in my field of work, I work quite closely with land managers, and so that research can be quite applied and actually have tangible outcomes for many species.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. And Natasha, you're kind of nicely leading into the next question, so I might start with you on that one. What are the different areas of research here that the Fenner School does, the Fenner School Environment Society do, in terms of linking it to conservation in an active sense?
Yeah, so here at Fenner, we have a strong research group that we cover quite a number of things that have an applied nature and help towards conservation of our species. So for example, myself and also Ben and David work within the Threatened Species Recovery Hub. And that's a really important research hub that works really closely with different organisations across Australia to help them improve their management. So for example, I do reintroduction biology working with Parks Australia, and working with these landowners and the traditional owners of Wreck Bay in Buddery National Park. We look at what are the things that we can do to improve the management of these species and help improve the conservation of these species in that environment. So research is a really important tool for looking at ways of improving our conservation. What are the threats? How we can mitigate those threats? And yeah, looking at different aspects of that, so to overall improve conservation.
Sweet, cool. Thanks, Natasha. Ben, what are the kinds of work that you do, particularly involving your work on frogs in conservation?
So the frog work, we've had a program for the last 10 years or so, and it links strongly with the ACT government as well as with the New South Wales government, and then feeds into the broader Commonwealth government assessments of frogs. So really with frogs, we're dealing with quite a unique set of factors, but something that people can relate to quite strongly at the moment. And that's a really bad disease that has been spread around the world by humans in the last few decades. So it's a bit unique in terms of frogs. They have also been impacted by habitat loss and other invasive species like many other species in Australia, but they are also really challenged by this disease. So we work closely with the ACT government on the threatened corroboree frog program. It's one of our iconic frogs in Australia, and we're trying to assist the recovery of that species. And so we're directly informing the reintroduction and management practices that are happening for that species. So again, like Natasha mentioned, we have really clear and strong links with the government. So a lot of our philosophies are about trying to directly translate that research that we're doing and that new knowledge that's being produced directly to the end users, and co-designing and co-developing that work with the end users. So it's not just about sending, say, a research findings or a paper to someone, but it's about directly from the start involving them in the process of research development. So we're answering questions that are really relevant for management needs.
That's great. David, what about in terms of long-term management? What are some exciting stuff that you've been working on with others?
Oh, we do quite a lot of work in different settings, in forests, in woodlands, and elsewhere. And so, for example, there's pretty good evidence now that the way that we do restoration work in agricultural areas really can make a big difference. And so that means that there's some really good research around where do we put plantings, how are they juxtaposed with areas of remnant native vegetation, how can we design them so that unwanted species like noisy miners and others don't colonize them, which means that the birds that we do want of conservation concern can actually do well. So there's some really exciting insights about how to redirect the next iterations of large-scale landscape restoration across agricultural Australia.
What's the most exciting finding you've come across so far?
In an agricultural setting, I think the most recent work that's being done on the value of farm dams, and this is something that Ben's very closely involved with as well, is that the vast majority of research done in agricultural Australia is about improving pastures for livestock. But in fact, all mammals, including livestock, have to drink water. And there's almost no work, in fact, there's no work done in Australia on the quality of water and how that affects animal production. And what we see is that farmers can reap huge benefits for livestock production from better quality water, but at the same time, if we do it the right way, we can actually have a huge biodiversity dividend at the same time. So it's a win for agricultural production, but also a really big win for biodiversity when it's done properly.
That's a brilliant finding that works for everyone and all parties. Craig, do you have anything to add in terms of current research you're doing here at the Fenner School?
Yeah, so we've had a whole range of different projects looking from an agricultural context in terms of how different soil properties, the distribution of soil properties are driving ecological function. Also looking more at the biological crusts, so those fine microscopic organisms. So we could be talking about cyanobacteria that's growing through the soil. So within the top 10 millimeters of the soil in a desert environment, how those organisms are responding to really fine, detailed environmental cues. So if we have a rainfall event in winter in the southern part of Australia, we often get a number of cloudy days. And so the cyanobacteria is able to grow, expand, and really lock the soil particles together. But if we get an intense summer storm, we might have the moisture, but we don't have the right sunlight conditions that really allow that cyanobacteria to colonize the soil. And therefore the protection that is offered to the soil is quite different depending on the rainfall patterns. Now that's really interesting if we start to think about shifting rainfall due to climate shifts. So if we move from a more winter to a summer-dominated rainfall, we start to change that ecological assemblage, and then we change and impact the protection that is offered to the soil surface as well. So there's all these big scale, there's these big scale drivers that are operating at a microscopic level. So it's pretty funky to get out there and, watch rainstorms come across and see the cyanobacteria breathe, basically.
That's really cool to hear, particularly how large-scale processes affect microscopic processes. Just as a heads up, I thought I'd give you guys as well a bit of that, what I do as a PhD student here. I'm doing work, as I said, looking at what makes plants rare, and that allows me to do a bit of field work out at Borderee National Park, doing vegetation surveys across different vegetation communities, whether they be forests, woodland, or heath. And I'm trying to find some rare plants, and also try and determine what kind of factors drive the rarity of these plants, whether they be fire or how these plants interacting with one another, or if we can actually determine if there are any characteristics that can make a plant rare, and we've been looking at it the wrong way for most of our lives. So that's some of the work that I get to do, and it means I do get to go on field work, which is one of the greatest joys of doing research in ecology and conservation. Cool. Now, our third question, and I might start with Craig on this one. So how is ecology taught at the ANU? What do the students get to learn, and how is this done, particularly in a practical sense?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Mina. I'm going to throw back to Ben because he's actually teaching one of our courses, Biodiversity Science. And then Ben, after you've talked about the actual biodiversity and ecology teaching, I'll come back in and I'll talk about the broader, how it nests in with what we do across the whole Fenner School. Thanks, Ben.
And so it's a little bit out of whack this semester, as it has been earlier this year with the global COVID pandemic. So has been a disruption for fieldwork, as people would expect. But in general, we have a big emphasis on getting out in the field, so learning hands-on. So that goes from working on campus. There's quite a lot of biodiversity on campus. It's a nice campus with lots of green space. It's adjacent to areas of natural habitat with Black Mountain Reserve adjoining parts of the campus. So there's relatively high biodiversity on campus. So we start looking there. We also go close by to adjacent woodlands and look at some of the processes there. And then there's also trips. So these are basically happening weekly with most of the sessions. So say the course that I'm convening this semester, we have a 1 hour lecture, and then we generally will have a 4 hour slot that's out in the field each week. And that also includes trips a bit further afar down to Namaji National Park, as well as to Timbimbilla, where there's a whole range of conservation programs. And the emphasis with those events is to directly link with people on the ground. So it's not just the class going out with the convener and the lecturers. They're going out and they're also meeting with people who work for say the ACT government, who are actively involved in conservation planning or implementation. They're meeting with managers from breeding programs at Timbimbilla, as well as broader national park managers as well. And there's also an optional overnight field trip down to Kyola, which is on the coast, which focuses intensely on trying to get experience in collecting data and designing wildlife surveys. So that's the broad sense. And so that's replicated across the other conservation and ecology focused courses here. So there's a big emphasis on linking with managers, but then also getting out into the field and putting the practices that we learn in the lectures and some of the underlying scientific principles into practice, so that we really illustrate them and see how they work in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think that's, that is such a great model of that theoretical knowledge that is being imparted about the biodiversity sciences, and then really applying it in terms of hands-on practical experience. And that basically underpins what we try to do here at the Fenner School, Environment and Society. We try to mix and blend that notion of any of our environment issues that we try to address always couples with a human element. And so having that understanding of how one biophysical or social factor interact with each other is really important. So we try to embed that in across all of our courses and our programs that we teach. But then what Ben was talking about as well was that the use of stakeholders and managers and co-design is so fundamentally important in how we move science forward. It's about understanding how management is operating now in the field, how we can work with them to design research projects, but at the same time, we're turning that into an educational experience as well. If we think about the options for study in biodiversity conservation within the Fenner School and at the ANU broadly, the degree that we offer is there's a single degree, so there's a Bachelor of Environment and Sustainability, and then there's also the Bachelor of Science that sits under the College of Science as well. You can come in via both of those pathways, and you can start to pick up a biodiversity minor, so that's a collection of 4 courses, or you can even, in next year, hopefully, you should be able to pick up a biodiversity major as well. And so that really just gives you the capacity to pull your degree together and send a very clear message on your completion document of what your focus area is. What sort of courses are value adding your knowledge in that biodiversity conservation space? We also work with our colleagues across different schools. So in the Research School of Biology, which just sits next door to us here, some of our students will be enrolled in courses over there, and some of our students will cross-register. So there's plenty of knowledge sharing that really value adds and builds your knowledge in the biodiversity conservation space. I think I could throw to David here and ask David to talk about the importance of working with people in terms of advocating change in how we manage or how even policy is influenced.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. There's a lot of people think about conservation as let's be out in the field and measure things. And there's a huge element to that. There's no doubt about it. It's one of the best things to do. But often affecting change requires not only working with other managers, so people from Parks Australia or local land services or catchment management authorities, but it also requires connecting with people that make policy within government, state government or federal government, or even local government. And it also requires working closely with Indigenous people in many cases when they're managing land. So to give people an example, we're in the process at the moment of working together with Natasha Robinson, who's on this Zoom meeting, on developing strategies for cultural burns on Aboriginal land, for example, at Budderay National Park. And the only way that there'll be change in that space is if people work together, because the way that Aboriginal people see land and the way that white people see land is really quite different. And so it becomes very much the social and ecological part of policy change and changing things on the ground. So it's actually quite a diverse, quite a complex space, but a really important space to see how we can manage landscapes and biodiversity better than we've been doing in the past.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that draws once again of the philosophy of the degree programs that we're trying to build and offer here, is that as a student coming through, you will be exposed to those notions of environmental policy. You know, how do we build policy? What are the fundamental building blocks? Right through to the complex biodiversity science, biodiversity conservation programs. You know, just that simple notion of how do human societies interact? What drives what? You know, how do you influence change? So all of these issues that our researchers in the room at the moment are experiencing on a daily basis, you know, that is what the students are exposed to in their degree programs as well.
That's a really nice summary of how ecology is taught at the ANU and the multitude of experiences that is offered here. And with that experience, this is an open floor, where can this knowledge of conservation and ecology take you in a professional sense or in terms of looking for careers once you've completed your degree? Anyone like to take the floor on this one and start?
Well, one of the things that's really important here is that the vast majority of graduates from the Fenner School over many, many, many years have actually been highly successful in the workplace, working in a whole range of different spheres, be it with independent private organisations such as Australian Wildlife Conservancy and Bush Heritage Australia, or working for consulting companies or overseas ENGOs in places like Geneva or New York and elsewhere, working in the United Nations. Then we have people that have gone on to have research careers or management careers, for example, in forestry organisations or National Parks and Wildlife Service, Parks Australia, right across a whole gamut of things. And so the general skills that you get from an undergraduate degree or postgraduate study at the Fenner School really set you up for a trajectory in environmental management, conservation science, or other aspects of natural resource monitoring, research, and policy. So it's a very practical set of degrees and very applied in many cases that really allow you to take a pathway in many different directions depending on what your interests are.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up, David. You know, that idea about choice is, you know, how you choose your pathway. There are many pathways that you can choose. It's the skills and the experience that are offered throughout these degrees that give that breadth of employment opportunities at the end. And I'd like to think that it's the involvement of the researchers too into our programs that really push students to contemplate the bigger pictures or the connections. You know, it's that continual exposure to the real world that mean that the graduates are in a position where they can hit the marketplace and then they can start to understand where they're fitting into the picture, so to speak. So it's just about that exposure of the real world in all of our programs that we offer that I think just give that slight different edge to a graduate exiting the Fenner School and the ANU.
I thought I'd ask Natasha, what's your personal experience been once you left and completed your undergraduate degree?
Yeah, so I've had a really exciting career to date so far. I started out my career, actually, I worked in Vietnam overseas, so I did an agricultural science degree, but I also did some electives in conservation because back then it wasn't really a thing to do a degree in conservation. Yeah, I did some work overseas in Vietnam in sustainable livelihood areas, which ties back into the work that Fenner does here as well, because they actually do run a field program to Vietnam now. So I started there, then I went and worked in Victoria in fire management, so ecological fire management. And that was really applied. So my work involved things like putting in prescribed burns, like actually lighting fires and fighting fires and planning for ecological burns and monitoring the effects of burning and bushfires in the landscape. And from there, I've ended up here at the Fenner doing research on reintroductions of threatened species and working with some of the world's best ecologists here at Fenner. So it's been quite a diverse career already, and it takes you places that are really exciting, and you get to work in some of the most beautiful places such as Buddery and places like that.
So what kind of reintroductions have you been working on so far?
So specifically, I work on reintroductions of the both threatened mammals, so southern brown bandicoot and also the eastern quoll. And so they've been quite successful to date. So Buddery National Park is an unfenced reserve, and so it still has introduced predators in the landscape, which are managed by Parks Australia. So it has been a big learning curve, working out what are the threats in the landscape and how to manage that. So we've worked quite closely with the park to address that. But yeah, it's an amazing experience to be working with conserving and enabling species to re-establish in landscapes that they've been absent from for decades.
Cool. Ben, do you have anything to add in terms of what your degree gave you in terms of a sense of a career?
Not so much. It's similar to Natasha's pathway as well. I guess, touching back on one of the earlier points, like to emphasize also the teamwork development. So a lot of the field-based work, I didn't touch on it before. When you're working out in the field, it's often not by yourself. And so that's from doing stuff as a student in the Fenner School, but also to when you're working in your professional career, you need to work in a team. So there's a lot of emphasis on building that teamwork, building that experience and that capacity to understand and get experience and practical experience in terms of working with different people to work towards a common goal. So that's something that we also really emphasize in the undergraduate courses. So a lot of the field work that we do for students is in groups of, say, 3 or 4 people, up to 5 people.
Yeah, that's really good point, Ben. I think I wonder too that another valid comment too is that often when students come in to a degree, they may not actually know where they want to end up being, you know, and that's okay, because the degrees are built in a way that it allows you to try a whole range of different things, and then specialise as you move through your degree program. So I think it's okay to give ourselves a little bit of slack, so to speak, and say, oh my goodness, I don't have a clear vision of where I want to be. That's all right. What we will do though is that in the process of finding where you want to go, you will then start to fine tune your knowledge. You will be exposed to a whole range of these different graduate skill sets that we're developing, just like group work or understanding stakeholders, working with managers, learning to communicate. All of that is generic across the whole program. I think we think about biodiversity conservation, as David has just pointed out. You know, there's a whole range of ways to interact in this space. We could be someone that works in the field, or we could be someone that has a really strong underpinning knowledge of the science, but more work in a managerial or even a policy space to advocate for change. All of those roles are so critical. So, you know, I think don't come into a degree quite concerned that you may not know where your vision is going, or have a set railroad vision. It might alter. You know, you might be surprised. You might be in a lecture about environmental economics and all of a sudden you go, oh, that is fantastic. You know, and you're then in a career where you're pivotal in quantifying the value of having biodiversity on farm in the future. So there's a whole range of different stories that can emerge. It's just about being open and learning with the experience as you go.
Yep, you're dead on there in terms of experience, Craig, because I came in doing my undergraduate degree thinking that my heart was set on small mammals, and somewhere along the way I did a course on plants and my mind was blown about how little I knew about the world of plants, and somehow I've ended up here doing a PhD in plant ecology. So it's the little experiences that make you realize what you want to do. Yeah.
All you need is one lecturer to say one sentence, and then that can change your vision of the world, which is the fantastic thing about university life.
Yeah. And on that note, we do have one question about doing work in the field. So in undertaking research in the field, what are some of the tools and activities a researcher might undertake? And what are some of the challenges of field work? But this is an open floor, so anyone wants to jump in?
Sure, I'll start. So yeah, I do a lot of field work at Buddery. Normally, not this year. This year has kind of changed a lot of our field work plans. But some of the types of field work that I do at Buddery, and I take on board typically a lot of volunteers to help as well. We do cage trapping, so we put out traps to catch the animals that we've released and check on their health and their weights and at certain times of the year if they're breeding, whether they got pouch young, for example. We also do a lot of radio tracking. So we put, for the bandicoots, we put little transmitters on their tails because they don't actually have much of a neck. So it's better to put a transmitter on around their tail. And we track them through the field using telemetry equipment. And with the quolls, we tend to put collars on them, and we also radio track them. Other types of field work can be like scat collection. So collecting their poo and analysing what's in that to look at their diet and see what they're eating. Yeah, and then also habitat assessment. So looking at, with the movement data that we collect by tracking animals in the field, we can look at what are their habitat preferences and then match that with what we're seeing in the field, and also using remote sensing imagery. So we can look at, you know, whether a bandicoot prefers to hang out in the forest or the coastal heath, or whether it hangs out at the beach, for example. So then we can sort of look at well, what kind of habitat are we trying to create or manage for particular species.
Cool. Thanks, Natasha. Ben, how do you go about surveying frogs?
Do a whole lot of different methods, from the most crazy method, which is walking around in the field and literally yelling out, "Hey frog," in a loud, deep voice. It sounds silly, but it does during the breeding season get the males to respond with their threat call. So we do that. Lots of nighttime surveys. So basically each frog species, and this is common across most species, they have different survey methods, so you tailor it down to the individual species. an example from teaching that we do in the second year course, there's a lot of development happening in the urban areas of Canberra. So in the Molonglo Valley, there's urban development happening on what used to be semi-rural or rural land, but some of that adjoins nature reserves. So there's a nature reserve, Karma Nature Reserve, which is a box gum grassy woodland reserve. And so what we've been doing is setting up camera traps. So these are little cameras that are set off there on a tree or on a pole with movement and with heat. And we've done monitoring across that transect. So from areas that are closer to urban development areas and getting baselines before the development happens to into the center of the reserve and then into adjacent farmland. So that's data that students are collecting. They're setting up the cameras, they're downloading all the images with help from us. They're identifying which species are present. And then we're able to relate that to what's happening in the landscape. And that's one of the examples of projects that tie in directly with people from the ACT government. So we're sharing that data with them. So that's actually an example of science happening through undergraduates and contributing directly to applied management. So that's informing what wildlife is using that reserve and how it might be impacted by urban development in adjacent areas.
David, how do you go about doing bird surveys?
Primarily the way we survey is what we call point interval counts. It's actually the form of fieldwork that I enjoy the most. So I can take out my binoculars and my clipboard and I can just stand quietly in a forest or in a woodland and listen for bird calls and estimate the distance to where I hear the call from. And it's in many ways, it's just another language, listening to language in the background. And I've done bird surveys that way for many, many years, over 20 years. But at the same time, we've started to do some other work. So we've had a wonderful PhD program here, people starting to look at how successfully birds breed in particular areas by finding nests and marking those and doing territory mapping of individual birds. So we've had a number of projects doing those kinds of things recently and some really spectacular results that give you very different outcomes than if you do point interval counts. So as Ben says with frogs, the same with birds, being able to do things in different ways, to be able to triangulate those different methods to get a sense of what's really happening out there. Because sometimes you can get a little bit of a false perception from just one particular method.
Craig, how do you go about undertaking fieldwork in relation to collecting soil samples?
Well, the first thing I learned in my undergrad days is that working with fauna means that you have to work with all sorts of times or tides or whatever. Soil, you don't have that problem. Or even biological plants, you don't have that problem. You can go out at any time of the day and you know you'll find them. So yeah, look, if I'm doing arid work, so I'm particularly interested in wind erosion, and so that means I go out into desert country. I will spend most of my days, early morning, late afternoons, out in the field collecting either dust samples. So we'll set up equipment that will collect the sediment that's moving around the landscape. And then I'll also look at respiration work, set up CO2 monitoring equipment to see when the biological soil crusts are actually respiring and photosynthesizing as well. So working with the biological community in the soil is really quite more taxing because you've got to actively be out there and monitoring. Whereas the moving of dust through the landscape, that's a little bit more passive. You know, I put up the instruments and let them suck the dust out of the air. But yeah, so it's a very multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, and just to give a perspective in terms of the plant world, the great thing about plants is they also don't run away, so you know where to find them. And most of the time, field work in terms of botanical sense is going out into the bush and seeing what's there and IDing them, trying to ID them in the field, and if not, with permission, taking samples, taking them back to the lab so that you can try and figure out what plants are there and perhaps what species are using those plants and why those plants are present in that location and not somewhere else. So I think the way that plants position themselves across the landscape is a really fascinating phenomenon. Cool. I think we've covered most of the questions. So does anyone have any final thoughts or suggestions or comments they'd like to add before we close this? Or any parting words or gifts for future students who might be here at the Fenner School and the College of Science, the ANU?
One of the things I think is important, Mina, is that often you don't really know what really interests you until you start to study, as Craig was talking about before. I know in my own case, I think I was about 27 before I really got serious about things that I was really interested in. But the degree work that I did was terrific, because it gave me a little taste of all different kinds of things and helped me understand the things that I didn't really want to do, but also started to point me towards some of the things that really pushed my buttons. And I'm really grateful for that opportunity. I actually did part of my undergraduate here at ANU. It was a long time ago, but it was terrific. And I know that the quality of teaching and engagement now is far better than anything that I ever had. But still, it was a wonderful experience even back all those years. So it is an exciting time. There's lots to learn. It's a terrific set of experiences, I think. And gosh, I think anybody that doesn't get a chance to go to university, I think that's really sad, because it is such a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, I totally agree, David. You know, and I think also in modern degrees too, there are so many options available, you know, to students, you know, and that might mean just simply doing a course over 2 weeks intensively, working 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock for 2 weeks. What a great opportunity, you know, means you can go and immerse yourself into a different landscape. It might mean being able to pick up an international field trip or an interstate field trip or a field course. It might also mean that you can do exchange programs internationally with other universities around the world. You know, that just builds, and as David was describing, it just gives you the opportunity to work out what you like, what you really are passionate about. And as soon as you can identify that, you're going to really strengthen yourself as a researcher, as a manager, as a whatever you're shaping yourself to be. You know, it just reinforces and everything just clicks. So it's a wonderful opportunity. And there are just so many things to do once you get in there.
And I think on the ecology and conservation front, it's something, and the offering, it's something that's being expanded at ANU. So within the Fenner School and also within the Research School of Biology, it's an area of growth. I think we've also seen probably an unprecedented awareness in the broader society about environmental impacts. So say with the 2019-2020 fires, people's, the broader society's perception of those fires and how they might impact biodiversity or wildlife really has changed. And so I think that it's something that increased awareness of the threats to our biodiversity and how we can preserve it and how we can save it. It's something that's really important going forward across our society.
Yeah.
Anything else to add, Natasha?
I guess what I'd add to that is I did agricultural science because my careers advisor back in year 12 said that you're never going to get a career in conservation. Everyone wants to be a conservation scientist and there's not enough jobs for you. But I guess like I did agricultural science and ended up doing a few electives in botany and conservation in different schools. I didn't come to the Fenner, I went to University of Queensland. And yeah, I think if you follow your heart and you follow what interests you, you'll end up in the space that you want to work. So I guess it just requires a bit of hard work and dedication and passion. So I'd say, yeah, if you're really interested in conservation, this is a really great school to study at.
Thank you all so much for all of your input and your expertise and hearing your voices. I'll hand it back over to Pete for some final thoughts.
Cool, thanks so much, Mina. And thanks so much for everyone who joined us today and for those of you watching on the recording right now. I've just put in the chat window our website, which lists the other activities happening this week from the Fenner School for the ANU Open Week. So you can see that there, but if you'd like to visit our website, it's fennerschool.edu.au. And I've also posted a link to a bunch of videos and a playlist showing various aspects of field work, field trips people have taken, and some of the research we undertake here at the school. So thanks so much for joining us, and thanks everyone to our panelists. And I'm going to close off this meeting here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.